May 26th, 1941. 21:10 hours, 300 miles west of Brest, France. The rain hammered against the fabric wings of the biplane as the pilot held his course through the storm. The Fairey Swordfish bucked and shuddered in the gale force winds. Each gust threatened to flip the aircraft over. The pilot gripped the stick with both hands, fighting to maintain altitude and heading. Through the open cockpit, visibility measured in yards, not miles. The rain drove horizontally, stinging like needles against exposed skin. The wind tore at faces, ice forming on goggles faster than pilots could wipe it clear. Leather flying suits, supposedly waterproof, had soaked through hours ago. Water ran down backs, pooling in seats. Hands were numb despite heavy gloves. Behind each pilot, observers and telegraphist air gunners huddled against the cold that had frozen the water in their bottles solid. The aircraft had been airborne for nearly 2 hours. 2 hours of fighting the storm. 2 hours of wondering if they would find their target. 2 hours of knowing that even if they did, survival was unlikely. Altimeters showed 800 feet. In these seas, that meant flying barely above the wave tops. Mountains of water rose 30 feet, sometimes 40. In the darkness, it was impossible to judge height accurately. More than one swordfish had flown into the sea while attempting low-level attacks. Below, somewhere in the darkness and the mountainous seas, steamed the most powerful battleship afloat, the Bismarck. 8 15-inch guns that could hurl 1-ton shells 22 miles. 50,000 tons of German naval might, protected by armour thick enough to shrug off shells from the Royal Navy's finest ships, 14 4.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, dozens of smaller caliber weapons, all aimed at stopping exactly what the British were attempting. And the weapon? A torpedo slung beneath a canvas-covered biplane that looked like it belonged in a museum, not in combat. A Fairey Swordfish, maximum speed 143 miles per hour with a good tailwind. Open cockpit, fixed landing gear. Construction of metal tubes covered in fabric that could be pierced by rifle bullets. The Germans had laughed when intelligence reports described it. This relic from the First World War could not possibly threaten the pride of the Kriegsmarine. Yet in the next 2 hours, this obsolete biplane and 14 others like it would accomplish what the entire British home fleet could not. They would cripple the Bismarck and seal her fate. The story of how a supposedly worthless aircraft became the weapon that changed naval warfare forever begins not in the storm-tossed Atlantic, but in the quiet offices of the Fairey Aviation Company 7 years earlier, where designers were creating what would become the most unlikely hero of the Second World War. 1934, Hayes, West London. The drawing boards at Fairey Aviation Company held the blueprints for an aircraft that already looked outdated the day it was designed. The Fairey Aviation Company had earned its reputation building naval aircraft since 1915. Founder Charles Richard Fairey had established the company during the First World War. They understood what the Fleet Air Arm needed better than any other British manufacturer. Reconnaissance to spot for naval gunfire, torpedo delivery to sink enemy warships, the ability to operate from the pitching decks of aircraft carriers in all weather conditions, robust construction that could survive harsh maritime environments, simple maintenance that could be performed by ship crews with limited facilities. The company designation read TSR-2, standing for Torpedo Spotter Reconnaissance. The proposed design featured a biplane configuration powered by a single Bristol Pegasus 3M.3 radial engine producing 690 horsepower. 2 wings stacked above each other, braced with wires, and struts like aircraft from the previous war. An open cockpit where crew would face the elements at altitude. Winter patrols over the North Atlantic meant temperatures dropping to -20 degrees Celsius. Summer operations in the Mediterranean brought scorching heat. The crew would experience both extremes, fixed landing gear that created drag and reduced speed. But the fixed gear simplified carrier operations enormously. No hydraulic systems to fail, no complex mechanisms to jam at critical moments. The wheels were always down, always ready for landing. The whole structure built from steel tubing covered with fabric, doped tight and painted, like aircraft from the First World War. Modern fighters featured all-metal construction with stressed skin, monoplanes with retractable landing gear and enclosed cockpits. The comparison seemed damning. Critics in the Air Ministry questioned whether Britain should be building obsolete aircraft. Some argued for cancelling the programme entirely and waiting for more modern designs. At a time when sleek monoplanes were becoming standard worldwide, the Fairey Design Committee chose the biplane deliberately. This was not ignorance or conservatism. It was calculated engineering. Naval aviation demanded different priorities than land-based aircraft. Carrier operations dictated design choices that seemed backward to those unfamiliar with the constraints. Aircraft carriers in the 1930s had short flight decks. HMS Ark Royal, completed in 1938, had a deck only 720 feet long. Modern jet carriers have decks over 1,000 feet long. The Swordfish had to take off and land in less than half that distance on a deck that pitched and rolled in heavy seas. Carrier operations demanded slow landing speeds and short takeoff runs. The biplane's large wing area provided exactly that. The Swordfish could land at 67 miles per hour. Modern carrier aircraft land at over 120 miles per hour. The difference meant the Swordfish could operate in sea conditions that would ground faster aircraft. The open cockpit, though uncomfortable, gave the observer unobstructed views for reconnaissance. Naval reconnaissance meant hours of searching vast expanses of ocean for enemy ships. The observer needed to see in all directions without obstruction. An enclosed cockpit with windows would create blind spots and reflections. The open cockpit was miserable in bad weather, but far more effective for the mission. The fixed landing gear simplified maintenance aboard ships where every tool and spare part had to be carried. Retractable landing gear meant hydraulic systems, pumps, reservoirs, and actuators. All required maintenance. All could fail. The fixed gear was simple, reliable, and foolproof. Most importantly, the simple construction meant any damage could be repaired quickly, even at sea with limited facilities. Combat damage that would write off a modern aircraft could be patched on a Swordfish. Fabric could be sewn. Steel tubes could be spliced. The aircraft could be flying again within hours. The prototype first flew on April 17, 1934. Test pilot Chris Staniland pushed the aircraft through its paces over the Hampshire countryside. The plane handled beautifully, responsive controls, stable in flight, forgiving of pilot errors. It could lift a torpedo weighing over 1,600 pounds, yet still operate from short carrier decks. By 1935, the Air Ministry placed orders. The aircraft received its operational name, Swordfish. 68 aircraft were contracted initially. Production began at Fairey's Hayes factory in early 1936. The first operational aircraft joined the Fleet Air Arm in July 1936 with 825 Naval Air Squadron aboard HMS Glorious. The Swordfish replaced the aging Fairey Seal in reconnaissance roles and the Blackburn Baffin in torpedo bomber duties. Pilots who flew it immediately recognized its qualities. The aircraft was utterly reliable. Engines ran smoothly for hundreds of hours. The simple fabric construction could absorb extraordinary punishment. One pilot later recalled landing with over 200 bullet holes in the wings and fuselage. The fabric could be patched in hours. The Swordfish's crew called it the string bag, a nickname that would become famous. The name came from the British housewife's string shopping bag, common in the 1930s. Like those expandable bags, the Swordfish could carry an improbable variety of loads. One day it might carry a torpedo, the next, bombs and flares, then mines or depth charges. The versatility amazed ground crews. Production expanded rapidly. Fairey built 692 aircraft at their Hayes facility. Blackburn Aircraft at Sherburn in Elmet in Yorkshire built an additional 1,699. Total production reached 2,391 aircraft by the time production ended in August 1944. The Swordfish would remarkably remain in frontline service until VE Day in May 1945, outliving the Fairey Albacore that was designed to replace it. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Fleet Air Arm operated 13 squadrons equipped with Swordfish. 268 aircraft stood ready. Most naval officers recognized the Swordfish was already obsolete. Modern monoplane fighters could fly twice as fast. But Britain had what it had, and the Swordfish would have to do. The world was about to discover that speed was not everything. April 1940. Norway. The Swordfish received its baptism of fire. Aircraft from HMS Furious attacked German ships anchored at Trondheim. Flying through Norwegian fjords, weaving between mountains, they pressed home their attacks against fierce anti-aircraft fire. They scored no decisive hits, but they returned safely, proving that Swordfish could survive in combat. Then came June 10th, 1940. Italy entered the war. Benito Mussolini's declaration opened the Mediterranean theatre. The Regia Marina, Italy's navy, fielded 6 battleships, including some of the most modern vessels afloat. They threatened Britain's vital supply lines to Egypt and India through the Suez Canal. The Royal Navy faced a problem. Italian battleships outgunned most British ships in the Mediterranean. Direct naval confrontation risked heavy losses Britain could not afford. The solution had to be unconventional. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Mediterranean fleet, began planning an audacious strike. If he could attack the Italian fleet in harbour, he might cripple their naval power before they could fully deploy it. The target was Taranto, the main Italian naval base in southern Italy. The plan was Operation Judgment. The weapon would be the Fairey Swordfish. November 11th, 1940. HMS Illustrious steamed 270 miles southeast of Taranto. In the hangar deck, 21 Swordfish were prepared for the most daring naval air attack yet attempted. Each aircraft was armed with either a single 18-inch Mark 12 torpedo or bombs and flares. The torpedoes had been specially modified with breakaway wooden fins to allow them to run in the shallow 30 to 40-foot depths of Taranto harbour. Standard torpedoes would have buried themselves in the mud. The modifications were experimental. No one knew if they would work. At 8:35 in the evening, the first wave of 12 Swordfish launched into the darkness. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson led the strike. His aircraft carried a torpedo. Behind him came 5 more torpedo bombers and 6 aircraft loaded with bombs and flares. The flare droppers would illuminate the target. The bombers would suppress anti-aircraft defences. The torpedo bombers would make the killing strikes. At 9:15, the second wave of 9 Swordfish launched. Lieutenant Commander John Hale led this group. 8 aircraft carried torpedoes. One turned back shortly after launch when its auxiliary fuel tank detached. 20 aircraft actually attacked Taranto that night, not 21. The flight took 90 minutes. The crews flew at 8,000 feet, navigating by stars and dead reckoning over the dark Mediterranean. Each observer hunched over his navigation table, calculating drift and ground speed. The pilots held steady courses, trusting their observers completely. 1 degree of error would mean missing the target entirely in the darkness over featureless ocean. Radio silence was absolute. Detection would mean failure. As they approached Taranto, they could see the harbour clearly despite the darkness. The Italians had obligingly left lights burning throughout the base and the surrounding city. Security concerns about spies evidently outweighed concerns about air attack. The Italian Navy did not believe the British would attempt a torpedo attack on a fortified harbour. Previous analysis suggested the water was too shallow for aerial torpedoes. The Italians were wrong on both counts. Barrage balloons floated above the harbour to deter low-level attacks, but only 27 were deployed instead of the planned 87. Strong winds that day had grounded most of them. The gaps in the balloon barrage gave the Swordfish clear approach paths they should not have had. Luck was favouring the attackers. The first wave arrived at 11:07. The flare droppers, flying high, released their magnesium flares. The parachute flares drifted down slowly, burning with intense white light. Night turned to day. Every ship in the harbour was suddenly visible in stark relief. The Italians were caught completely by surprise. Air raid sirens began wailing. Searchlights stabbed into the sky. And then the guns opened fire. The harbour erupted with anti-aircraft fire. Land batteries fired 13,489 shells during the attack. Ships added thousands more. The sky filled with tracers, explosive shells and shrapnel. Red, white and green tracers arced upward. Heavy shells burst in black puffs. The noise was deafening. The defending gunners had never faced an actual attack before. They had drilled, but drill is not combat. Their fire was intense, but not always accurate. They were shooting at slow-moving biplanes that jinked and turned unpredictably. The Swordfish pressed their attacks through the storm of fire. Williamson dove his aircraft toward the battleship Conte di Cavour. At 30 feet altitude and 200 yards range, he released his torpedo. The torpedo ran true, striking the ship below the waterline. The explosion tore a massive hole in the hull. Conte di Cavour settled onto the harbour bottom, partially sunk. Williamson's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire. He and his observer, Lieutenant Norman Scarlett, survived the crash and were captured. Lieutenant Neil Kemp attacked the new battleship Littorio. His torpedo struck home. Then Lieutenant Charles Lamb made his run on Littorio. Another hit. The battleship was taking water fast. The second wave arrived shortly after midnight. More flares lit the harbour. More anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. Lieutenant Gerald Bailey dove toward the cruiser Gorizia. His aircraft was hit and crashed in flames. Bailey and his observer, Lieutenant Henry Slaughter, were killed. But the other torpedo bombers pressed their attacks. Littorio took a third torpedo hit. The battleship Caio Duilio was struck by one torpedo and began listing. By 2:39 in the morning, it was over. 20 Swordfish had attacked the main base of the Italian battle fleet. 2 aircraft were shot down, 2 men killed, 2 captured. 4 casualties from 20 attacking aircraft against the entire defensive firepower of a major naval base represented extraordinary results. Some called it luck. The Italian defences had been less effective than they should have been. The barrage balloon gaps helped. The Italian gunners were firing at night against difficult targets, but luck only explains so much. The Swordfish crews had trained for exactly this type of mission. They had practiced night carrier operations. They had rehearsed torpedo attacks. They had studied the defences of Taranto from reconnaissance photographs. They executed the attack with precision and courage. The results were devastating to Italy. 3 battleships damaged. Conte di Cavour took 1 torpedo hit that tore open her hull. She settled onto the harbour bottom with her deck awash. She was eventually refloated and moved to Trieste for repairs. The work was never completed. She never returned to full service. The Italian Navy had effectively lost a battleship permanently. Littorio was hit by 3 torpedoes and nearly sank. Only desperate damage control kept her afloat. She was out of action for 7 months, undergoing repairs. Caio Duilio took 1 torpedo that flooded 2 boiler rooms and caused severe list. She too was out of action for 7 months. Italy's battleship strength was cut in half in a single night. Italy began the war with 6 operational battleships. After Taranto, only 3 were available. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted dramatically in Britain's favour. The strategic consequences rippled outward. With the Italian battle fleet crippled, the Royal Navy could operate more freely in the Mediterranean. Convoys to Malta could be escorted more heavily. The route to Egypt became more secure. British Admiral Andrew Cunningham could take risks he could not have taken before. The Italian Navy became more cautious, less willing to risk its remaining battleships in direct confrontation. Italian naval strategy shifted to preserving the fleet rather than using it aggressively. The raid had strategic consequences far beyond the Mediterranean. Japanese naval planners studied the attack intensely. The Japanese naval attaché visited Taranto in January 1941 to examine the damage and interview Italian officers. The lessons learned at Taranto informed the planning for Pearl Harbor 11 months later. Shallow water torpedo attacks were possible with proper modifications. Battleships in harbour were vulnerable to air attack. A bold carrier strike could cripple an enemy fleet before it could respond. All these lessons from Taranto appeared at Pearl Harbor. The Taranto raid proved that aerial torpedoes could devastate capital ships in harbour. It validated carrier aviation as a decisive offensive weapon. And it demonstrated that the obsolete-looking swordfish, in the hands of skilled crews, could accomplish what seemed impossible. But Taranto was merely the beginning. 6 months later, the Swordfish would face an even greater challenge, May 1941. The Bismarck sortied into the Atlantic. The newest and most powerful battleship in the German fleet displaced 50,300 tons fully loaded. 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, 12.6-inch armor belt. Maximum speed of 31 knots. The ship was designed to break out into the Atlantic shipping lanes and wreak havoc on the convoys supplying Britain. The Royal Navy deployed everything available to stop her. May 24, 1941. The Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, engaged Bismarck. Hood was the largest warship afloat, 42,000 tons, 15-inch guns, famous throughout the world. The battle lasted 15 minutes. Bismarck's fifth salvo struck Hood. A 15-inch shell penetrated the thin deck armor and detonated in the aft magazine. 112 tons of cordite propellant exploded. The ship's back broke. Hood sank in less than 3 minutes. 1,418 men were aboard. 3 survived. Ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William Dundas. The shock rippled through the Royal Navy and across Britain. Hood was invincible, or so people believed. She was the largest warship in the world, a symbol of British naval supremacy. Children knew her name. Her image appeared on postcards and cigarette cards. She had represented British power around the world between the wars, visiting ports on every continent. The public believed nothing could sink Hood. Bismarck had destroyed her in minutes. The psychological impact was immense. If Hood could be sunk, what was safe? Now the German battleship was loose in the Atlantic with the speed and firepower to devastate convoy routes. Britain depended completely on Atlantic convoys. Food, fuel, raw materials, weapons, all came by sea. The convoys were escorted by destroyers and corvettes that had no chance against a battleship. Bismarck could slaughter merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The lifeline to America could be cut. Starvation could force Britain to surrender within months. Every available British ship was ordered to hunt Bismarck down. Battleships steamed from multiple directions. Cruisers formed search lines. Destroyers rushed to join the hunt. But finding one ship in the vast Atlantic was nearly impossible. Radar was primitive. Air search was limited by range. The ocean was simply too large. And even if found, Bismarck might outrun or outfight her pursuers. She was fast, heavily armoured, and powerfully armed. Direct engagement would cost lives and ships. The Admiralty needed a way to slow the battleship down, damage her machinery, jam her steering, reduce her speed enough that the pursuing battleships could catch her. They needed the fleet air arm. They needed the Swordfish. HMS Victorious was operating with the home fleet searching for Bismarck. The carrier embarked 825 Naval Air Squadron, the same unit that had struck at Taranto. Their commanding officer was Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. On the evening of May 24th, Bismarck was located. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet, ordered Victorious to launch a strike. At 10 p.m., 9 Swordfish took off into deteriorating weather. Esmond led the formation. The target was 120 miles away. The weather was appalling. Low clouds, rain squalls, rough seas. The Swordfish pressed on. Just after midnight, they found Bismarck. The battleship was steaming at high speed, her anti-aircraft guns ready. The Swordfish attacked from different angles to split the defensive fire. They dove through a storm of shells. Tracers arced across the night sky. Explosions bracketed the slow-moving biplanes. Lieutenant Percy Gick, flying in aircraft 5F, released his torpedo. The weapon ran true and struck Bismarck amidships on the starboard side. The explosion was visible to all the Swordfish crews. But the torpedo hit the armor belt. The damage was superficial. Bismarck's thick armor protected her. However, the impact ruptured fuel tanks, causing an oil leak. The leak would help British forces track the battleship over the next 2 days. All 9 Swordfish returned safely to Victorious despite the heavy fire. The attack had not stopped Bismarck, but it had demonstrated that the Swordfish could reach and attack even the most heavily defended target. For 2 days, the Royal Navy hunted Bismarck across the Atlantic. The battleship was damaged, leaking oil, but still dangerous. On May 26th, a Catalina flying boat relocated the ship. She was heading for the French coast and safety. If Bismarck reached Brest with its air cover and coastal defences, she would escape. Admiral Tovey's battleships were too far away to intercept before Bismarck reached French air cover. Only one force was close enough. HMS Ark Royal. The carrier raced to intercept. But the weather was deteriorating into a full gale. Launching and recovering aircraft would be extremely dangerous. Attacking in such conditions seemed suicidal. But there was no choice. This was the last chance to stop Bismarck. At 1450 hours, 15 Swordfish from 810, 818, and 820 squadrons launched from Ark Royal. The carrier was pitching and rolling violently. The flight deck rose and fell 40 feet. Launching was hazardous. Several aircraft nearly crashed on takeoff. They formed up and headed toward the target. Due to a radar contact confusion, they initially attacked the British cruiser HMS Sheffield by mistake. Fortunately, the torpedo's magnetic detonators malfunctioned in the rough seas and exploded prematurely. Sheffield was not hit. The Swordfish returned to Ark Royal. The mistake was embarrassing but ultimately fortunate. The magnetic detonators were clearly unreliable. The torpedoes were switched to contact detonators for the next strike. At 1910 hours, 15 Swordfish launched again. The weather had worsened dramatically. Winds approached 60 miles per hour with gusts even stronger. Rain reduced visibility to near zero. Some pilots could not see the wingtips of their own aircraft. Waves reached 40 feet, creating mountains of water that rose higher than the Swordfish flew. The pilots could barely see their instruments in the gathering darkness. Water streamed into open cockpits, soaking instruments and making the compasses difficult to read. Flying in such conditions was normally prohibited as suicidally dangerous. Aircraft were simply not designed to operate in such weather. Control could be lost at any moment. Structural failure was a constant risk. Collision with the sea in darkness was probable. But this was not a normal situation. The future of the war might depend on the next 2 hours. If Bismarck escaped, the consequences were unthinkable. The Swordfish flew through the storm toward Bismarck. Each pilot fought his own private battle with the elements. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat was among the pilots. He later recalled that he could barely control his aircraft. The buffeting was so severe he thought the wings might tear off. Every gust threatened to flip the biplane inverted. Water streamed into his open cockpit, soaking him completely. His hands were numb on the controls despite thick gloves. His observer and air gunner huddled behind him, equally soaked, equally cold, equally terrified. Visibility was measured in yards. The formation was impossible to maintain. Each aircraft flew alone through the storm, navigating independently. Some pilots wondered if they would find the target. Others wondered if they would survive the weather regardless. The fabric wings flexed and strained. The steel tube framework groaned, but the Swordfish held together. The robust construction that looked so antiquated was proving its worth. At approximately 20:05, they found Bismarck. The battleship was silhouetted against storm clouds, her guns already firing. The Swordfish attacked from multiple directions. The slow speed that made them obsolete now became an advantage. Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns were designed to track fast modern aircraft. The Swordfish's slow approach confused the fire control systems. Shells burst around them, but the evasive maneuvering in the rough weather made accurate fire nearly impossible. The pilots pressed their attacks to point-blank range, less than 1,000 yards. Some even closer. They released their torpedoes and turned away through the storm of fire. At least 2 torpedoes struck Bismarck. One hit amidships on the port side, causing relatively minor damage. The armour held, flooding was contained. This hit would not stop the battleship. The second torpedo hit aft, near the stern. This was the critical strike. The explosion jammed the battleship's rudder at approximately 12 degrees to port. The massive rudder, designed to turn 50,000 tons of warship, was locked in position. The steering gear room flooded rapidly. Damage control. Parties rushed to the scene. They found the compartment flooded, the machinery wrecked, the rudder immovable. Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, immediately ordered emergency steering procedures. The engines could be used to steer by varying power to the 3 propeller shafts. This worked for slow-speed maneuvering, but was nearly useless at sea speed. The battleship began steaming in circles, unable to maintain course. Divers were sent down to examine the rudder. The seas were too rough. They could not reach the damaged area. Engineering parties tried to rig emergency steering using the auxiliary rudder or by directly manipulating the steering gear. Nothing worked. The damage was catastrophic. The rudder would not respond. Without steering, Bismarck could not reach France. She could not even effectively fight. She was limited to 10 to 12 knots and could only steam in slow arcs, unable to take evasive action or choose her course. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the operation, signalled Berlin that the ship was no longer manoeuvrable. He knew what that meant. The British battleships were closing. Without steering, Bismarck was doomed. The question of which Swordfish pilot fired the critical torpedo has been debated for decades. Sub-Lieutenant John Moffat is commonly credited with jamming Bismarck's rudder. His aircraft attacked from the port side in the first wave. However, when James Cameron led a diving expedition to examine the Bismarck wreck in 2002, the physical evidence was puzzling. The torpedo damage to the steering compartment was on the starboard side. Only 2 pilots attacked from starboard, Sub-Lieutenant Kenneth Pattison and Sub-Lieutenant Douglas Godfrey Fawcett. The actual pilot who fired the rudder-jamming torpedo may never be conclusively identified. Multiple torpedoes hit. Any one of several pilots might have fired the decisive weapon. What matters is that collectively, the Swordfish crews accomplished their mission. Moffat himself never claimed credit at the initial debriefing. The popular attribution came later. All 15 Swordfish returned safely to Ark Royal despite the appalling conditions and heavy fire. Landing on the pitching carrier deck in darkness and storm was as dangerous as the attack itself, but every aircraft made it back. Every crew survived. The next morning, May 27th, British battleships caught up with Bismarck. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney pounded the crippled battleship with heavy shells. Bismarck fought back but could not manoeuvre. After 2 hours of bombardment, the German ship was a burning wreck. At 10:39, Bismarck sank. 2,000+ crew died. 115 survived. The pride of the Kriegsmarine was gone. The threat to Atlantic convoys was eliminated, and the weapon that made it possible was the obsolete Fairey Swordfish. The Swordfish would continue to serve throughout the war in roles that evolved as the conflict progressed. In the Mediterranean, Swordfish squadrons operating from Malta and from carriers became the primary strike weapon against Axis supply lines to North Africa. Malta-based Swordfish flew night attacks against Italian and German convoys carrying supplies to Rommel's Afrika Korps. These attacks were conducted in darkness, often in bad weather, against heavily escorted convoys. The Swordfish crews developed tactics for finding convoys at night using radar, then attacking with torpedoes or bombs. The successes were significant. Squadron 830, operating from Malta, sank approximately 110,000 tons of Axis shipping between May and November 1941. That represented dozens of merchant ships carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and vehicles that never reached North Africa. Other Malta-based squadrons achieved similar results. Conservative estimates suggest 300,000 to 450,000 tons of merchant shipping was destroyed by swordfish attacks throughout the Mediterranean campaign. Every ship sunk meant supplies that did not reach Rommel. The cumulative effect was substantial. Rommel frequently complained about supply shortages. His offensive stalled partly because fuel and ammunition did not arrive. Swordfish attacks on supply convoys contributed significantly to those shortages. In the Atlantic, the Swordfish's role evolved as escort carriers entered service. These were small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ships. They could accompany convoys and provide air cover throughout the crossing. Escort carriers typically embarked one squadron of Swordfish for anti-submarine and anti-surface duties. The Swordfish proved highly effective in this role. Equipped with ASV-2 radar, Swordfish could locate surfaced submarines at night or in poor visibility. U-boats preferred to attack at night on the surface where they were faster and harder to spot. The Swordfish with radar could find them. Once located, the U-boat would be attacked with depth charges or torpedoes. Between 1940 and 1945, Swordfish sank or participated in sinking between 14 and 22 U-boats. The variation in the count depends on how shared kills are credited. Some U-boats were attacked by multiple aircraft or ships. Some were damaged by Swordfish but sunk by other forces. Notable anti-submarine successes included several firsts. U-64 was sunk on April 13, 1940 by Swordfish from HMS Ark Royal. This was the first U-boat sunk by the Fleet Air Arm. The aircraft, flown by Captain Richard Partridge of the Royal Marines, caught the submarine on the surface in Norwegian waters and sank it with bombs. U-752 was sunk on May 23, 1943 by a Swordfish from 819 Squadron flying from HMS Archer. This was the first U-boat sunk by air-launched rockets. The Swordfish was carrying 8 60-pound rocket projectiles under the wings. The rockets proved highly effective against submarines. They could be fired from longer range than depth charges and were more accurate. In September 1944, Swordfish from HMS Vindex sank 4 U-boats in a single patrol. U-344 on January 31st, U-765 on May 6th, U-960 on May 19th, U-1194 on June 24th. This exceptional performance demonstrated how effective the Swordfish had become in anti-submarine warfare despite its age. But the Swordfish's service was not without terrible cost. February 12, 1942. The German battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen attempted to dash up the English Channel from Brest to Germany. The ships had been trapped in Brest for months, subject to constant Royal Air Force bombing. Hitler wanted them moved to Norway where they could threaten Arctic convoys to Russia. The Channel Dash, Operation Cerberus to the Germans, was a bold move. The narrowest part of the channel was only 21 miles wide. The German ships would have to steam through waters dominated by British naval and air forces. The risks were enormous, but the alternative was to remain in Brest under constant attack. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were determined to stop the dash. If the German ships could be sunk in the channel, it would be a major victory. Plans were made for coordinated attacks by destroyers, motor torpedo boats, bombers, and torpedo bombers. 6 Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron were assigned to the torpedo attack. The squadron was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond, the same officer who had led the strike on Bismarck from Victorious 9 months earlier. Esmond had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for that action. King George VI personally presented the decoration on February 11th, the day before the Channel Dash. The timing was cruelly ironic. Esmond received his medal for bravery one day, before facing an even more desperate mission. Esmond knew the mission was nearly suicidal. The intelligence briefing made that clear. The German ships would be protected by approximately 30 escort vessels, including destroyers and torpedo boats. Over 250 Luftwaffe fighters would provide air cover. The Swordfish would be attacking in daylight, not the darkness that had protected them at Taranto and against Bismarck. They would have minimal fighter escort due to coordination failures and the short range of available Spitfires. Their chances of survival were negligible, their chances of success were worse. Esmond assembled his crews and briefed them honestly. The mission was vital, the risks were extreme. Any man could refuse without dishonor or consequence. Every man volunteered. Not one hesitated. They understood what they were being asked to do. They did it anyway. At 12:20 p.m., the 6 Swordfish took off from RAF Manston in Kent. They flew at wave-top height toward the German ships. British Spitfire fighters were supposed to provide escort, but coordination failed. The Swordfish found themselves alone, facing the entire German force. Focke-Wulf 190 fighters dove on them. The slow biplanes were helpless against the modern fighters. Anti-aircraft fire from the ships filled the air. The Swordfish pressed their attack. All 6 aircraft were shot down within 20 minutes. 13 of the 18 crew were killed. Eugene Esmond's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire and set ablaze by fighter attacks. It crashed into the channel around 12:40. Esmond died, along with his observer Sub-Lieutenant William Clinton and his air gunner leading airman Donald Bunce. 5 crew survived, rescued from the freezing water. Sub-Lieutenants Edgar Lee, Brian Rose, Charles Kingsmill, and William Samples, and leading airman Bunce, who had somehow survived when Esmond's aircraft crashed. None of the torpedoes hit the German ships. The Channel Dash succeeded, but the sacrifice was recognized. Eugene Esmond was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, gazetted on March 3, 1942. The 4 surviving officers each received the Distinguished Service Order. Leading Airman Bunce received the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. The 13 killed received posthumous mentions in dispatches. Even German Admiral Otto Ciliax, commanding the Dash, acknowledged the attack as an act of supreme courage. The Royal Navy called it one of the finest exhibitions of self-sacrifice and devotion to duty the war had ever witnessed. The 825 Naval Air Squadron had struck at Taranto. They had attacked Bismarck. They had sacrificed themselves in the Channel Dash. Their courage became legendary. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Swordfish had served for 9 years. Production had ceased in August 1944 after 2,391 aircraft were built. The type had outlived multiple aircraft designed to replace it. The Fairey Albacore, intended as the Swordfish's successor, entered service in 1940 but was withdrawn in 1943. The Albacore was faster and had an enclosed cockpit, but it lacked the Swordfish's reliability and versatility. The Swordfish continued flying frontline missions until VE Day in May 1945. Few military aircraft can claim such longevity while remaining effective. The Swordfish earned affection from everyone who flew it or maintained it. Pilots praised its handling, its reliability, its forgiving nature. Mechanics loved its simple construction and easy maintenance. Crews trusted it completely. The nickname Stringbag was used with genuine fondness. The aircraft looked ungainly and outdated. It was slow and uncomfortable, but it worked. In all conditions, in all weather, the Swordfish could be counted on to fly the mission and bring the crew home. That reliability earned loyalty that modern aircraft with better performance never quite achieved. Today, 8 decades after the Swordfish crippled Bismarck, we can assess its place in history. By every technical measure, the Swordfish was obsolete before the war began. Maximum speed of 143 miles per hour when contemporary fighters flew over 300. Open cockpit when enclosed cockpits were standard. Fixed landing gear when retractable gear was normal. Fabric construction when metal was universal. A biplane when monoplanes dominated. Yet this obsolete aircraft achieved victories that changed the course of the war. At Taranto, Swordfish crippled the Italian battle fleet and shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Against Bismarck, Swordfish delivered the attack that sealed the fate of Germany's most powerful battleship. Throughout the war, Swordfish protected convoys, sank U-boats, attacked shipping, and performed every mission asked of them. The key was never the aircraft. The key was always the people who flew it. The Swordfish was just fabric and wire and steel tubing. But the men who flew it were extraordinary. They were superbly trained. The Fleet Air Arm maintained rigorous standards. Pilots mastered instrument flying, navigation, torpedo attacks, and carrier operations. Observers became expert navigators and bombardiers. Airgunners learned to fight off attacks while operating their radios. The training was intense, comprehensive, and continuous. The air crews were deeply motivated. They understood the stakes. Britain stood alone for much of the war. Every mission mattered. Every attack counted. Failure meant defeat. Success meant survival. The motivation was existential. The tactics were innovative. Rather than lament the Swordfish's limitations, the Fleet Air Arm exploited its strengths. Night attacks where speed mattered less. Low-altitude approaches below radar coverage. Coordinated strikes from multiple angles to overwhelm defenses. Using the slow speed to confuse anti-aircraft fire control systems, the tactics turned weaknesses into advantages. The determination was absolute. Swordfish crews pressed attacks through defensive fire that should have been suicidal. They flew missions in weather that grounded other aircraft. They maintained formation when conditions were nearly impossible. They completed missions when survival seemed unlikely. That determination made the difference between failure and success. Superior people using adequate tools will defeat adequate people using superior tools. The principle applies far beyond military aviation. In any field, human factors matter more than technology. Training, motivation, innovation, and determination trump specifications. The Germans had Bismarck, the most powerful battleship afloat. They had superior technology, but they did not have superior people at the decisive moment. The Swordfish crews, flying obsolete aircraft, possessed the skill and courage to accomplish what seemed impossible. Britain in 1941 could not match German technology across the board. British tanks were inferior to German tanks. British fighters were roughly equal to German fighters. British bombers had less range than needed, but Britain could train superior crews and develop superior tactics. The Swordfish program exemplifies this approach. Take the aircraft you have, train the crews to excellence, develop tactics that work, apply them with determination, accept the risks, complete the mission. The approach worked. When the war ended, the men who flew the Swordfish returned to civilian life, carrying memories of extraordinary experiences. They had flown obsolete aircraft into seemingly impossible situations and prevailed. They had faced death repeatedly and survived. They had accomplished things that would seem fictional, if not thoroughly documented. Their legacy extends beyond their combat achievements. The Swordfish crews demonstrated that technological inferiority need not mean defeat. They proved that well-trained, highly motivated people can overcome material disadvantages. They showed that courage and skill matter more than specifications. These lessons remain relevant 8 decades later. In an era obsessed with advanced technology, the Swordfish story reminds us that human factors determine outcomes. Organizations invest heavily in equipment while sometimes neglecting training, maintenance, and morale. The Swordfish experience suggests this is backwards. Invest in people first. Superior people will find ways to make adequate equipment effective. The Fairey Swordfish entered service in 1936, already outdated. It remained in service until 1945, outlasting aircraft designed to replace it. It achieved victories that changed history. It earned the affection and respect of everyone associated with it. The string bag, slow, ungainly, obsolete, but deadly effective in skilled hands, the Germans laughed at Britain's outdated biplane. Until torpedoes from that biplane crippled Bismarck and sealed her fate. Then the laughter stopped. The world learned what the Fleet Air Arm already knew. The Swordfish, for all its limitations, was exactly the weapon Britain needed when it was needed most. That is the legacy of the Fairey Swordfish and the remarkable people who flew it into history.